So good afternoon everyone and welcome to the next series in our webinars. Today I'm going to be covering off redundancy and furlough. I do hope that you find this webinar useful and will also join us for future webinars which we will be running throughout the year. So do keep your eyes peeled for upcoming dates and topics. So firstly, I just wanted to kick off by introducing myself. This is me. I'm Leanne Cox, a HR business partner for Clover HR. Day to day, I support a number of employers on a range of topics, from ad hoc issues such as dealing with short-term absences and disciplinaries, to projects such as policy, contract reviews, and also redundancies. I've been involved with mergers and acquisitions previously, which has resulted in medium-scale redundancies, where there's been a crossover in roles and responsibilities. And I've also been involved in restructures and downsizing of companies. So that's just a little bit about me and my background. In terms of Clover HR, we are your trusted people advisors, but also much more than that, as we have specialists within our team in recruitment, learning and development, coaching, health and safety, and we're able to provide value support in all of these areas. This picture was taken at our last team gathering, which was back in February prior to lockdown. We do have a few new members of the team, and I'm sure as soon as we can all get together again, we'll be having an updated photo, but that is us. At the end of the webinar, I will provide you with my contact details for you to send me over any questions or queries you have. So if you could just hold on to them until the end, that would be great. Hopefully I have muted all my microphones, and I do ask that you keep your microphones muted throughout the session, just to help keep background noise to a minimum for those that are listening. So now looking at what we will be covering today: redundancy and coronavirus job retention scheme, managing redundancy, planning, selection pools and volunteers, the consultation process, dismissals, redundancy costs and payments. So first of all, before we get into all that, I just wanted to cover off what is defined as a redundancy situation. Redundancy is a special form of dismissal which happens when an employer needs to reduce the size of its workforce. In the UK, an employee is dismissed for redundancy if the employer has ceased or intends to cease continuing the business, or the requirements for employees to perform work of a specific type or to conduct it at a location which they are employed has ceased, diminished, or is expected to do so. If there is a genuine redundancy, employees must follow the correct procedure in line with UK employment law. Employees who don't may be liable for unfair dismissal claims or protective awards. Redundancy can be very challenging and upsetting for the affected employees and also the wider workforce. Announcing redundancies can affect employee morale, motivation and productivity. Therefore, it is vital employers do handle redundancy situations as sensitively as possible to reduce any negative impact. Before getting into the process for redundancy, I just wanted to cover off how redundancies are being affected by the coronavirus job retention scheme and some additional considerations this has for businesses. So the coronavirus job retention scheme was implemented to avoid redundancies as a result of the current pandemic. The original scope of the scheme was to enable businesses to retain staff who would otherwise have been made redundant as a result of the economic consequences of COVID-19. The government has broadened the purpose of the scheme to help employers who cannot maintain their current workforce because their operations have been severely affected by COVID-19 to retain their employees and protect the UK economy. The overarching purpose of the scheme has been to save jobs and protect the UK economy during the pandemic. The guidance seems to indicate that employees may be made redundant whilst on furlough or afterwards, with the note for employees stating your employer can still make you redundant while you're on furlough or afterwards. And the note for employers states when the government scheme ends, employers must make a decision depending on their circumstances as to whether employees can return to their duties, and if not, it may be necessary to consider termination of employment. The guidance is clear that whilst on furlough and afterwards, employees still have the same employment rights in relation to redundancy and protection from discrimination or unfair dismissal. Therefore, it is crucial that employers only implement redundancy dismissals where there's a genuine redundancy situation and they have followed a fair redundancy process in line with UK employment law. That said, the availability of the coronavirus job retention scheme and other government support packages available does add another layer to the normal redundancy process. Employers must always show they've tried to avoid redundancies, proceeding without considering current government measures in relation to coronavirus as alternatives, such as placing employees on furlough, may encourage employees with over 2 years service to prevent unfair dismissal claims. The usual redundancy process must be followed. This means following the company's own procedure, if there is one in place, and any other stages defined in UK employment law. Employers who have already furloughed employees can still start the redundancy process once all other alternatives have been exhausted. So below I've outlined some of the main considerations for businesses in regard to redundancy whilst employees are on furlough. So firstly, the logistical issues. So how will you communicate with the affected employees? Can the consultation process be conducted remotely? And do all the affected employees have the equipment and skills to participate in a digital process? Then looking at how the business is proposing to select employees for redundancy. Is it purely based on the fact that they are furloughed? If so, there is a risk, depending on the reasons for employees having been placed on furlough in the first place, that the selection process that was used to do this, that the approach may give rise to claims of discrimination and unfair dismissal. Where an employer could have retained an employee on furlough, a redundancy dismissal may be deemed unfair, and also employees may be entitled to be paid their full salary during their notice period and for any annual leave, even if they've only been receiving 80% of their pay whilst on furlough. It's important to remember new government guidance is being published regularly during the pandemic, and therefore it's important for both us and businesses to keep this matter under close review. It is expected that at least a quarter of UK employees will make some form of redundancies as a result of the current pandemic. The situation we're in is unprecedented, but employers who decide there is no alternative to redundancy must still follow a normal and fair process. Right, so now moving on to the redundancy process itself. The exact procedure will vary according to timescales and size of a redundancy programme, but the below stages are recommended as a minimum. Planning, identifying the pool for selection, seeking volunteers, consulting employees, selection for redundancy, appeals and dismissals, suitable alternative employment, redundancy payment, and counselling and support. Every employer should consider having a formal redundancy procedure if there's not already one in place. Throughout the planning phase, businesses should always try attempt to avoid redundancies wherever possible. Some suggestive alternative approaches for businesses to consider include natural wastage, recruitment freezes, stopping or reducing overtime, offering early retirement to volunteers. Here you do need to make sure you comply with the age discrimination law, retraining or redeployment of employees, offering existing employees sabbaticals and secondments, pay freezes, short time working, and any other alternatives to redundancies by where employees do not work for their employer for a specific period and are free to seek work whilst receiving an allowance. It's important to note here, before being able to implement any of the above changes, you will need to check employees' contracts enable you to do so. And then just another note on planning, you will need to be mindful that where redundancy will involve more than 20 employees, you must inform the redundancy payment service via a HR1 form before the start of the consultation process. So now moving on to identifying the selection pool. You must carefully identify the group or groups from which employees will be selected for redundancy. This will usually consist of at least one of the following: those who undertake a similar type of work, those who work in a particular department, those who work at a relevant location, and those whose work has ceased or been reduced or is expected to do so. It may be necessary to identify a range of selection pools, and it's important to note here, if an employer fails to consult and consider a selection pool correctly, the dismissal may be deemed unfair. So now moving on to looking at volunteers. As an option, you can consider offering voluntary redundancy as an alternative to compulsory redundancy. This gives affected employees an option to volunteer to take redundancy when the business is faced with a redundancy situation, and an incentive is normally offered in exchange for employees volunteering. There are some pros and cons to offering voluntary redundancy. On a positive note, offering voluntary redundancy is viewed as a more positive move from an employer than simply enforcing redundancy onto employees. However, on the other hand, you can risk losing your best employees, as it is often these people who offer themselves up as they are confident in finding new employment elsewhere. But it's not mandatory that you actually select anyone who offers themselves up for voluntary redundancy. And also, just another point to bear in mind is that costs can be higher, as employees with the most to gain financially are often the ones that choose to go. So now moving on to look at consulting with employees. There's a few points I just wanted to point out as part of the consultation process. So firstly, as well as individual consultation, if 20 or more employees at one establishment are to be made redundant, collective consultations with recognised trade unions or elected representatives must start within the minimum timescales. So if it's dismissal of 100 employees or more, it's at least 45 days before notification of redundancies. And if it's dismissal of 20 to 99 employees, it's at least 30 days before the notification of redundancies. Collective consultation must be completed before notices of dismissal are issued. If there are no recognised trade unions or employee representatives, the employer must facilitate an election where employees volunteer or are selected as representatives for the consultation period. The law does require a meaningful consultation, so it's not just enough for businesses to inform employees of a decision that has already been made. If you are looking at making less than 20 employees redundant, then there are no minimum statutory timescales. However, the individual consultation process must be meaningful and may also be covered off by contractual terms or policies. It's important to know employees are entitled to be accompanied at all individual consultation meetings by either a trade union representative or a colleague. So I've mentioned it a couple of times now about the need for the consultation process to be meaningful. So what do we mean by that? A meaningful redundancy consultation process means more than simply informing employees of a decision already made. ACAS state that you should listen to the employee and genuinely consider any of their suggestions. This will give you a better chance of finding alternative jobs for affected employees and provides an opportunity for ideas and options to surface that you hadn't considered or previously identified. There needs to be a two-way dialogue with the objective of finding ways of avoiding the dismissal if at all possible. So, for example, this could be things such as job sharing, sabbaticals, or a reduction in hours. At the start of the consultation process, the employer is legally obliged to give the following information. So the reason for the redundancy dismissal, the number of proposed redundancies and their job types, the total number of employees affected, the proposed method of selection, the procedure to be followed in dealing with the redundancies, and the method for calculating redundancy payments. So when selecting employees for redundancy, choices must be based on objective criteria. So these can be things such as length of service, attendance records, disciplinary records, skills, competencies and qualifications, work experience and performance records. And remember, objective selection criteria can be weighted. So just some other points I wanted to make on selection. Last in, first out can be a risky method, as those with less service are likely to be younger. So this could result in claims of age discrimination. That said, case law does show that last in, first out may still be relevant as part of a wider range of selection criteria. It just must not be used as a sole method, and you must be able to justify using it. Employment tribunals look favourably on selection procedures based on a point system which scores each employee against relevant criteria. Here it's important to note that you take care in the choice and application of selection criteria to avoid any type of discrimination. Scoring should, if possible, be carried out independently and by at least 2 managers who know all employees in the selection pool. The marks from the 2 assessors should then be added together to give a total score for each employee. So now just going back to employees on furlough and selection for redundancy. Automatically selecting employees for redundancy purely on the basis that they have been furloughed could be problematic for a number of reasons. So firstly, looking at how the employees were selected for furlough to begin with, what was the process and criteria used, and whether these were fair in the circumstances and remain fair. It's likely that at the point redundancy becomes necessary, an employer would have to reassess the fairness of the pools and selection criteria and consult with employees to ensure that any redundancies are not deemed unfair. Secondly, you need to review if employees on furlough are due to care and responsibilities or are self-shielding for health reasons. Selecting these employees for redundancy is likely to constitute indirect discrimination based on either sex, disability, or age. And finally, there remains a grey area around the question of whether selecting someone for redundancy when they could remain on furlough may result in unfair dismissal. Employers need to consider whether it would be reasonable in the circumstances to wait until the furlough scheme ends and the company is no longer able to claim employee costs under the scheme for implementing any redundancies. So now moving on to dismissals and appeals, the employer should give written notice to those selected for redundancy that they are at risk of redundancy and invite them to individual meetings. At least one further consultation meeting should be held. The actual number of meetings will depend on what the employee has to say. The employer must consider any points that the employee puts forward. Once the individual consultation is complete, the employer must decide whether the employee is to be made redundant and give a written redundancy notice. This will either be the statutory minimum notice or the contractual notice, whichever one is greater. The employer must also explain the redundancy payment calculation to the employee. And remember, all employees should be allowed to appeal against the redundancy decision. So looking at suitable alternatives, some points I just wanted to cover off. Employers must consider offering suitable alternative work to employees being made redundant. If employees unreasonably refuse suitable alternative work, they may lose their entitlement to a statutory redundancy payment. Employees can have a 4-week trial period in a new role. If at the end of the trial period, the employer and the employee agree that the role is not a suitable alternative, then the employee reverts to being made redundant. And the law requires employees who have at least 2 years service to be given paid time off to look for work during the final notice period. So now moving on to look at redundancy costs and payments. There are various direct and indirect costs to employers associated with redundancy. So direct costs include any contractual or statutory redundancy payments. Employees with 2 or more years service are entitled to minimum statutory redundancy payments, which currently is half a week's pay for each full year service you were under 22, 1 week's pay for each full year service you were 22 or older but under 41, and 1.5 weeks pay for each full year service you were 41 or older. The weekly pay is currently capped at £538, and the maximum statutory redundancy payment is £16,140. So then some indirect costs to consider: management time, higher labour turnover, and loss of output resulting from the reduced morale and engagement of surviving employees. Which then moves us on to survivor support. In any redundancy situation, the employer's immediate priority should be the fair and sensitive treatment of those employees who are going to be losing their job. Once this has been achieved, the business's ongoing effectiveness is largely dependent on the morale of survivors. I think it's fair to say that a demoralised workforce who are anxious about job security and potentially critical of how the business has handled the redundancy process is not likely to feel committed or engaged. So to help support those who continue to be employed through the process, it's good practice for businesses to give a full explanation of the situation to all employees, including the redundancy procedure being used, explain the need for change, give an overview of any further reorganisation and or changes in working arrangements, provide a forward-looking positive attitude for the future and show survivors the value of their role, and carry out individual discussions with remaining key workers where necessary to reassure them of their importance and employment prospects. So that is it in a nutshell. I am conscious that we have covered off a lot in today's session. So I just want to end by recapping the key stages to managing any redundancy. So planning, identifying the pool for selection, seeking volunteers, consulting employees, selection for redundancy, appeals and dismissals, suitable alternative employment, redundancy payment, and counselling and support. In relation to employees on furlough, you can start the redundancy process. However, then just a final note from myself. Redundancy should be a last resort. It can be one of the most distressing events an employee can experience. And as a result, it does require sensitive handling by the employer to ensure fair treatment of redundant employees, as well as the productivity and morale of the remaining workforce, sexual orientation, marital status, disability, race or religion or any other protective characteristic is unlawful under the Equality Act 2010, and every redundancy situation and process will be unique. And that is it for today. I would like to thank you for attending today's webinar and your attention. We have covered off a lot of content, but I hope you have found this session useful. Do let me know if you have any feedback or comments, or if there's anything you would like to see in future webinars. Do let us know and we will try to accommodate where we can. Off the back of today's session, we are running a special offer of, it will be a 1 hour review of your redundancy policy. We're going to run this offer for 2 weeks, so it will expire on the 23rd of June. If you are interested, then here are my contact details, or if you have any questions or queries, then please do get in touch. My email address is there and also my phone number. We will be posting this webinar on our website and also our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to share with others or watch again, then please feel free. That is it for today. Thank you again for attending. I do hope you found this session useful, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on future webinars.